They say the past always finds a way to return. In Nicolás' case, this return came in the form of a metallic clatter in the basement of a house he swore he'd left empty. It all began when he moved to an old fishing village on the coast of Norway, a village so isolated that it wasn't even on some modern maps. The choice of location was strategic. After losing his wife in a brutal fire and being dismissed from his job as a marine biology researcher, all he wanted was to disappear for a while, and that place seemed dead enough for it. The village, named Glåmstrand, consisted of only 18 houses, most abandoned, and a small crooked chapel on top of a hill covered by constant fog. The only signs of life came from an elderly man named Ernulf, who occasionally left fish in a basket near Nicolás's house, without ever saying a word. The weather was always humid, the sky eternally cloudy, and the smell of the sea carried a sour tang, as if something were rotting beneath the wet earth. In the first few days, Nicolás found a kind of peace in that silence. But on the fifth night, he heard what he would later describe as the sound of something being dragged with nails against stone. It came from the basement, which he hadn't yet explored. He grabbed a flashlight, went down the creaking steps, and found a metal door locked with a thick chain. The strange thing was that he had never noticed that door before. Stranger still was the faint smell of salt and iron coming from inside. The next day, he tried to ignore what had happened, but the noises continued, now more frequent. Shadows passed through the crack in the door, and voices in a language he didn't know whispered his name. Curiosity began to erode his reason. Nicolás started studying the house's blueprint and discovered that the structure had been built on a medieval foundation, something local fishermen avoided commenting on. That's when he decided to force the chain with a tool Ernulf had left days earlier. When the chain broke, an unbearable odor spread, mixing rotten flesh, ancient mold, and something that smelled sickly. Behind the door was a stone staircase that descended far beyond what would be physically possible for that house. It took hours to gather the courage to go down. Armed with the flashlight and an old crucifix he found in one of the upstairs rooms, Nicolás descended. With each meter, the walls seemed to pulse slightly, as if made of flesh. Dripping sounds echoed all around. At the end of the stairs, a corridor opened into a kind of circular hall with inscriptions carved in languages he had never seen, even though he was used to studying ancient dialects in his previous career. In the center of the hall was a stone altar, and something on it. It was a body, or what was left of one, shrunken, flayed, with marks that didn't seem to be made by human tools. And around the body, shoes, dozens, small, large, women's, children's, some still with dried bloodstains. Nicolás felt his stomach churn, but he didn't vomit. He was too paralyzed for that. The moment he touched the altar, the lit candles around it extinguished, and a new presence was felt. First was the sound, something walking with wet, slow, dragging steps. Then the cold. A cold that didn't come from the air, but from within his bones. Then he saw. It wasn't exactly a creature, but a shapeless amalgamation of human limbs, faceless, with whitish skin and black veins running like roots all over its body. It, or that thing, whispered disconnected words, and from the folds of its flesh came small eyes open in wrong directions, all staring directly at him. Without thinking, Nicolás ran back. The staircase seemed to have tripled in size, and the flashlight began to flicker. Upon reaching the door, he saw that the chain had closed again. He pushed it hard until he finally managed to get out, locking the thing on the other side. But at that moment, he knew. That creature knew his name, his story, and had fed on someone like him before. The next day, he went to Ernulf's house and demanded answers. The old man didn't speak. He just led him to the chapel hill and showed him the unmarked graves. According to him, that thing down there always wakes up when someone tries to forget. Their pain in that village, it always wants more. And it always takes. Since then, Nicolás began to hear the creature at night, scratching the wood, calling his name, with the voice of his deceased wife. One night, he saw Ernulf being dragged through the fog towards the beach, his feet leaving a dark trail until they disappeared into the sea. Only the basket of fish remained, now full of worms. And that's when Nicolás understood the creature needed offerings. Since its last appearance, Nicolás had stopped sleeping. The creature now manifested even during the day. Distorted reflections in mirrors, voices coming from inside the closet, silhouettes appearing on the walls like human-shaped damp stains. Sometimes, when he blinked, he saw his wife's burning body in front of him, calling him with her twisted arm. Other times, it was Ernulf, completely disfigured with empty eye sockets, whispering that the sea was hungry and that he knew it. Desperate, Nicolás tried to leave the village. He packed a backpack with essentials and followed the gravel road leading out. But he never reached it. He walked for hours, but the fog only grew denser, and all he saw ahead was the same road, curve repeated indefinitely. When he decided to turn back, the village had changed. The houses were now even more deteriorated. Some covered in black lichens that seeped through the windows. Others had open doors, as if waiting for him to enter. That night, there was no sleep, just a waking dream. A sound of distant drums echoed through the village. Footsteps began to be heard on the roof of the house, but it only had one floor. When he looked out the window, he saw dozens of people, or what they once were, standing in the field in front, all with their faces covered by red cloths, their bodies in twisted positions, as if they had been assembled by someone who didn't quite understand what a human being was. One of them raised a hand and pointed at him. And then they all began to scream with the same voice, "You are the one she wants." The next day, the creature stopped hiding. It appeared before Nicolás in the main living room of the house. It was larger, more distorted, with new limbs and Ernulf's face growing on its side like a grotesque tumor. The entity writhed and its bones cracked at irregular rhythms. The sound was worse than any scream, a constant noise of agony, as if the thing were alive, but against its own will. And there, for the first time, it spoke in its own voice. "Pain needs form. Your pain gave me flesh." Nicolás tried to destroy it. He threw fire, tried to flood the basement, knocked down house beams to block the stairs. But it was all useless. Every attempt seemed to feed the thing even more. One dawn, he realized that the whole house was pulsing, as if alive. The walls breathed. The floor was hot and wet. He went down to the basement again, this time to end it once and for all. But what he found down there was no longer the same corridor. It was an abyss, an infinite space without floor, without ceiling, full of screams coming from all sides. Hanging over nothing was an angel, or what was left of one. Skinless, with its eyes torn out and its face covered in stitches. It whispered a single phrase, "You too will be a root of this flesh." Nicolás ran back. His mind was beginning to fragment. He no longer knew if the sounds he heard were real or memories. He began to record everything in notebooks, chaotic scribbles of symbols, faces, and maps that made no sense. Every night, a new person appeared in the village, always a familiar figure, always someone he knew to be dead. In one of these encounters, he saw his old university advisor hanging on an inverted cross, his arms slowly being pulled by tentacles coming from the sea. He screamed for Nicolás to run, but it was too late. By this point, he was no longer just a survivor. He was part of that place's history, part of the offering. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath. Yes, it's heavy, and it's going to get worse. But before we continue, I want to invite you to join this community of brave people who enjoy stories like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next accounts, and I guarantee even darker things are coming. Now, answer me something in the comments. If you were Nicolás, what would you do? Would you try to escape? Or would you face the creature knowing there might be no way out? I want to know what you would do in this situation. Seriously, let's talk in the comments. Nicolás's world had transformed into a distorted mirror of reality. Every morning he woke up in a different room of the house, as if he were being moved while he slept. Sometimes he awoke in the attic, other times in the basement, locked from the inside, with the marks of the chain imprinted on his wrists, as if he himself had chained himself and forgotten. The days no longer followed a logical sequence. He began to find versions of himself walking through the village, pale doppelgängers with whitish eyes who watched him from afar, smiling. One day, one of these copies called him to follow it. Without knowing why, he obeyed. The figure led him to the cemetery behind the chapel, now overgrown with twisted trees and roots emerging from the gravestones. There, in the center, was an open hole. Inside it, a staircase made of human vertebrae descended to a hall buried underground. Downstairs, dozens of figures prayed on their knees, facing an image carved into the wall, the creature. But here, it had a name, Mødr Løst, the lost mother. According to the inscriptions, Mødr Løst had been born from the pain of an ancient massacre, when women and children of the village were ritually drowned to prevent a plague. The collective guilt of the village and the despair of the victims created an entity made of living suffering, nourished by memories. That's why it manifested with the faces and voices of the past. It was a parasite of memory. The more someone tried to forget, the stronger it became. Nicolás then understood why it had chosen him. His pain for his wife, unresolved grief, guilt over her death. These were fertile ground. He was a complete meal. The entity didn't just want to kill him, it wanted to absorb him, wear his story, his suffering, his flesh. That same night, the figures began to knock on the doors of the abandoned houses. Nicolás saw them through the windows, one by one, lighting black candles in circles drawn on the ground. These were summoning rituals, and he was the sacrifice. When they finally invaded his house, he didn't flee. He was too tired to fight. He let them take him to the beach, where the black tide rose, covering even the beached boats. There, in the center of a giant symbol made of bones and sand, he was laid down. He felt cold hands holding each limb of his body. Above him, the sky opened in a vertical crack, as if the world were being torn apart. From within it, Mødr Løst descended, now complete, giant, overflowing with flesh and lament. Its eyes, dozens of them, stared at Nicolás, each one showing a memory of his. The fire, his wife's scream, the moment he chose not to enter the burning house. But before the ritual was complete, something happened. One of the doppelgängers, the one who had led him to the cemetery, attacked the figures. It was as if a part of Nicolás's consciousness had rebelled against fate. Chaos ensued, screams, breaking bones, the sand being swallowed by a kind of black liquid. He seized the opportunity and ran, but not to the village. He ran to the sea. Mødr Løst screamed, a sound that made the world bend, but he threw himself into the water. As he dove, he no longer felt cold. He felt freedom. He knew he would die there, but he preferred that to servitude. However, he did not die. He woke up 3 days later on the coast of another city, more than 80 kilometers from Glåmstrand. He was naked, covered in seaweed, and his eyes were bleeding. He was taken to a hospital where doctors said he had had a psychotic break. They didn't believe a word, but they never found any village with the name he described, not even old maps, nothing. He tried to move on with his life. He changed his name, went to live in rural Iceland. But every 3 nights, he wakes up with sand in his mouth, and with the feeling that something is growing inside him, something that breathes silently when he dreams. If you've made it this far, take another breath and tell me, do you think Nicolás really escaped? Or was it just another illusion of the creature? Comment below with a sentence you would say if it were the last thing you could say before being taken by Mødr Løst. Let's see how far your creativity goes. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Here, we tell stories that keep you awake, and you're part of it now. The first few months in Iceland were silent. Nicolás chose an isolated village among ice-covered mountains, where the internet was unstable and neighbors were rare. He rented a cabin near a lake and spent most of his time writing about the experience, trying to organize it, to rationalize it. He tried to convince himself that everything was nothing, more than a delusion induced by trauma and sleep deprivation. He tried until he found the shoe. He was fishing when his line got snagged. When he pulled, it wasn't a fish, but a child's shoe, soaked, covered in slime. and with the name Nicolás sewn into the insole. From then on, everything collapsed. The mirrors began to distort his reflection. Whenever he passed in front of one, he saw his image moving its lips without emitting a sound. He started hearing footsteps in his cabin at night, sounds of dripping water even when there was no plumbing. Dead birds began to appear on the windowsill with their eyes torn out. The lake began to bubble for no reason. Once again, Nicolás tried to escape. He returned to the nearest town and bought a ticket to another country. He decided to go to Japan, where no one knew him, and the language was a sufficient barrier for the past not to reach him. But at the airport, while waiting for his flight, something made him freeze. A child, with his back turned, wearing the same shoe he had found. When the child turned, it had his own face, not as a reflection, but as a deteriorated portrait of himself. The figure smiled and disappeared into the crowd. He didn't board the plane. Nicolás returned to the cabin, determined to confront whatever was pursuing him. He set up cameras, recorders, lights, everything he could to document what he was experiencing. He wanted to prove he wasn't crazy, but all he captured were interferences, distorted signals. The only clear thing in one of the recordings was a whispered word, repeated 7 times: return. It was then that he received a letter. Yes, a letter, handwritten, left on his doorstep. The envelope was made of skin. Inside, a map of the way back to Glåmstrand, and below, a shaky note. She left something inside you. The terror changed form. Nicolás began to feel his body differently. Internal movements that weren't his. Contractions, pulsations, as if something were growing under his skin. In a moment of desperation, he plunged a knife into his own thigh, trying to tear out whatever it was. When he opened the wound, he didn't see flesh. He saw eyes, small, motionless, all turned towards him. The pain was unbearable. But the revelation, even more so. The creature didn't want him as an offering. It wanted to use him as a conductor, as a seed. He was the vessel through which Mødr Løst could cross into the world outside the village. Glåmstrand was just the cradle. Now she needed new soil, and he was the fertile ground. The next dawn, the cabin exploded in sounds and screams. The walls melted like wax, and the furniture floated in the air, spinning in a spiral. From the center of the room, a leaky, crack rift opened, not in the floor, but in the air, as if the fabric of reality were tearing, and from within arms began to emerge. Dozens, some with claws, others with human fingers, and voices, so many voices, speaking phrases from people he had known in life, his wife, childhood friends, even the local market attendant, all saying the same thing. You took us with you. He fled once again, now aimlessly. He crossed borders on foot, lived as an indigent, without documents, sleeping in shelters, in forests. But no matter where he went, there was always someone who recognized him. There was always a shadow with too many eyes. There was always sand on the pillow. If you're still with me in this story, you're already part of it. But I ask you now, are you sure you're alone there? Look around, listen carefully. Is there a sound that shouldn't be there? Some uncomfortable sensation you can't explain? Exactly. Mødr Løst likes those who listen to the end. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone brave. But do it differently. Send the story with the phrase, "She's growing inside us," and wait for the reaction. Then tell me in the comments. Years passed, but Nicolás aged quickly. His hair turned white, his eyes sank, and his skin took on an almost translucent pallor. The creature within him fed on his memory, his fear, his guilt. He knew he was living on borrowed time, and worse, he knew he was no longer just himself. One morning, he woke up voiceless. He also woke up in a place he didn't recognize. A dry field, surrounded by gray hills and dry trees like skeletal hands. He didn't know how he had ended up there. The sky was red, sunless. and in the center of the field was the metal basement door from Glåmstrand. The same one, without explanation. On the ground, there were footprints, but not his, of other people, of children, of adults, of people who never came back. When he opened the door, he descended, for the last time. Now, the basement was infinite, a labyrinth of flesh, bone, and suffering. The walls were made of faces, all familiar. People he had left behind, people he had betrayed, people who trusted him. Each face whispered a part of the story, each one a memory he had tried to bury. In the center, he found Mødr Løst in her final form, a fusion of everything he feared most. Her body was half human, half structure, columns made of arms, pillars of human spines, and her head was his wife's, but not as he remembered. Her. It was her at the moment of the fire, charred, twisted, yet alive. She invited him in, said the cycle needed to complete, said he was the missing link between two worlds, the last breath before the creation of a new one. Nicolás tried to resist, but he felt his body bending uncontrollably. He felt the UI's creature pulsing in sync with his heart. In the final instant, he understood. What grew within him was not just pain. It was continuity. Mødr Løst was a legacy. She could not be destroyed, only passed on. And so it was. In the city of Ålesund, a girl named Freya woke up crying that same morning. Her parents found her in a panic, saying that a man with hollow eyes and cracked skin had appeared in her room. He whispered a name to her, Glåmstrand, and then vanished, leaving only sand footprints on the floor. A week later, Freya disappeared. In police records, it's just another unsolved case, but in obscure internet forums, similar reports began to emerge. People disappearing, memories of places that don't exist, photos with strange details in the background, extra eyes, too many hands, shadows that don't match the light sources. And there are those who say that from time to time, a video appears, a simple video with a person speaking directly to the camera telling a story about a forgotten village, a locked basement, and a creature called Mødr Løst. Whoever watches starts to dream of the sea. And you? Are you ready to forget this story? Or will you carry it with you forever? If you've made it this far, truly, I thank you with all my heart and soul. This isn't just a video. This isn't just a story. This is an invitation, a pact of imagination, and perhaps something beyond it. Subscribe here to the channel, but not as a number. Subscribe as a guardian of these stories, as someone who gets chills in the right places and faces fear, not as weakness, but as courage. Here, you are part of this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced something no one believed? Something that haunts you to this day? Share it with us. Your story might be the next one to find a voice here. And if this story moved you, tell me what struck you the most. What did you learn from it? Not all terror comes to destroy us. Sometimes it comes to show us parts of ourselves that deserve to be seen, even if they scream in pain. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next video, every week, every night, when the lights start to flicker and the silence seems deeper.